Chapter 6 will focus on the development of the self. Video 1 will cover what I mean when I say the self, as well as self-esteem. Video 2 will then look at the emotional self, and Video 3 will focus on identity development during adolescence and emerging adulthood. To get started, let's go over some basic concepts of what we're talking about when we say the self. Every person has a construct of who they are. Answers to questions such as, what kind of person am I? What characteristics make me who I am? What am I good at? What am I bad at? How do other people see me? All of these different questions answer who we are or who our self is. We know that changes are made throughout development to the answers to these questions. And these changes come from many different sources, but a lot of it comes down to self-reflection and socialization, how society, our environment, impacts us, and how our own cognition about ourselves impacts who we are. As you might imagine, the period of adolescence and emerging adulthood is a time of great change, great self-reflection, and heightened socialization. So because of that, we actually see a lot of change in self or self-concept during this developmental period. So let's talk a little bit more about self-concept specifically. This is the answer to all of those questions we just went over, our understanding of who we are as individuals. As we move through adolescence and emerging adulthood, our self-concept becomes much more abstract. During childhood, our self-concept has more to do with our likes and dislikes, who our friends are, and sometimes our abilities. It tends to be very clear-cut. I'm good at this, I'm a friend, I'm a student. But as we get older, as we move through this transitional period, we take on a lot more levels. We take on ideology. We take on an understanding of a less clear-cut picture of ourselves. I'm good at being a friend sometimes, but not so good at it at other times. I am someone who believes in this, but there's exceptions. So our self-concept becomes much more realistic and much more abstract. Part of that involves becoming much more complex, much less simplistic, shades of gray, contradictions. All of these different aspects of who a person are become an understood part of our understanding of self. So let's take a second and look at how self-concept relates specifically to culture. We talked a lot about culture during the last chapter, the last two chapters actually. So let's take a second to investigate how this impacts our understanding of who we are. As I mentioned earlier, self-reflection and socialization produce our self-understanding or our self-concept. So, as you might imagine, we see this breakdown very differently depending on collectivist and individualistic cultures. An individual coming from an individualistic culture is more likely to have what we call an independent self. And this is where we view ourselves as our own entity, as, of course, an individual. A person who exists independently of what's going on around them. When you have an independent self, you are socialized in a different way, or if you come from a culture that encourages that. And the independent self involves a lot of self-reflection, time spent thinking about who you are, what you're good at, what you're bad at, what you want, what makes you you. The independent self also encourages self-value, or, as we'll talk about in a second, self-esteem. So the goal here of the independent self is often to value ourselves highly and to spend a lot of time developing who we are as a person. In contrast to that, we also see the interdependent self. This is more dominant in collectivist cultures, where an individual views themselves primarily as part of a whole, or rather we define ourselves. We answer those questions we talked about earlier by looking at how we function as a part of a family, as a community, as a structure of people. So in this situation, rather than encouraging reflection on self, We devalue self-reflection. It's not as important to develop a thorough understanding of yourself or even a thorough positive view of yourself. It's more important to consider where you fit in the system, in the community, rather than how you feel about yourself as an individual. Another interesting aspect of self-concept that we want to cover are the different types of self that exist. Because if you take a second and think about the answer to the question, who are you? You can take that question in a lot of different directions. There's who we are now. There's who we want to be. There's who we are at home, who we are in public. And there's who we don't want to be, even. And all of these different constructs of self are important. They all impact our psychological well-being. They all impact our behavior. And because of that, they all impact our self-concept. So we want to start out with the actual self. Your actual self is who you currently perceive yourself to be. But we also have possible selves. If I were to ask you to take a second and imagine your life 30 years from now, you can imagine a lot of different possibilities, a lot of different possible selves, the different paths that we might take, the different people we might become, depending on how our life plays out. Interestingly enough, we know that the increase in abstract thought that we see during adolescence actually allows teenagers to understand that their actual self and their possible selves are different. Young children have the tendency to view their possible selves as their actual self. So if you were to say, imagine yourself 30 years from now, they're going to assume that who they are now is who they're going to be. This is a very almost optimistic view of the world, but having an understanding of possible selves can be beneficial. It can help us try to achieve our goals and things like that. We also see the emergence or the development of an ideal and a feared self. Part of those possible selves, that collection of people we might become, are going to be people we want to be, or our ideal self, how we hope we are in the future. But we also develop the feared self, the person we do not want to become, the potential possible self that we hope to avoid in the future. Both of these different possible selves pop up during adolescence. As I mentioned a second ago, these different selves can be motivating or harmful. Perceiving differences between ourselves, who we are, who we want to be, who we don't want to be, who we might be, can be very motivating. It can cause us to try to chase our dreams, to better ourselves, but it can also be harmful to our self-esteem. Another example of a type of self or an aspect of ourselves that I want to go over is the person that we are when we're around other people. Another aspect of that more complex self-concept is an understanding of the fact that we can be contradictory. We know, based off research, that our understanding of self, our desires, our motivations, our moral beliefs don't always consistently link up with our behavior, meaning that oftentimes we behave in a way that we wouldn't expect ourselves to, or even want ourselves to. The environment plays a big role in motivating behavior. Part of developing a complex understanding of ourself involves understanding the power of the situation, understanding that just because I am a very calm, peaceful person doesn't mean that there's not something out there that could push me over the edge to make me more aggressive. And that's a very important aspect of self-concept, understanding that there's differences between who we are and who we are in certain situations. Part of this is what we call our false self. And this is the person we project to other people. The facade we put on when we're around others or when we're in social situations. As you can probably relate to, there are social situations that we often find ourselves in where we behave differently. We might almost change who we are, at least on the outside, in order to fit in better, in order to do better at school or at work, because the social situation kind of makes us put on that mask. We call this, again, our false self. It may be very different from how we really feel or how we really think about ourselves. We might behave in ways that, hey, we even think that's immoral. We might lie sometimes in public situations or social situations, even if we think lying is bad. We all have this false self, and adolescents begin to understand who that false self is and even what motivates that false self to come out sometimes. We've covered self-concept, an understanding of who we are as a person. The next aspect of the self that I want to cover is self-esteem, a term I'm sure you are all familiar with. But just to refresh your memory, self-esteem refers to our overall sense of self. When it comes to value and well-being, you can think of self-esteem as how we feel about who we are. Do we like ourselves? Do we not like ourselves? We see self-esteem fluctuate throughout the lifespan. That's normal. Typically, what we see is an increase in self-esteem during childhood and a sharp drop-off as we enter into adolescence, where young teenagers often have a much more negative view of self or judgment of self than younger or older peers. Luckily, after those first few years of adolescence, our self-esteem does start to rise. And as we enter late adolescence and early emerging adulthood, we do see a big increase in the value we place on our own self, on our self-judgments. So I want to talk for a second about where that decline comes from. I mentioned that self-esteem declines during early adolescence. A big part of this has to do with that increased social pressure. Imaginary audience, that aspect of adolescent cognition we talked about, where we feel like everyone's watching us all the time, hurts our self-esteem. We also see an increase in peer orientation. Our peers matter more to us. The judgments of our peers matter more to us. That can cause the self-esteem to take a hit. And of course, while all of this is happening, we're going through puberty. Those hormone changes are going to occasionally dock our self-esteem as well, as does gender intensification, where we become more preoccupied with reflecting our desired gender. So all of this together makes it kind of a tricky situation to navigate in terms of our feelings about ourselves. But luckily, it does tend to go up again. We see a rise in positive self-esteem later on in adolescence and as we enter into early emerging adulthood. A big part of this comes from decreases in the areas we just mentioned, but an increase in the amount of control we have over our own life. A fun aspect of that is also a decrease in the awkwardness that is often seen in the physical appearance of adolescents. And then we also see better relationships. Relationship quality goes up. We're getting to choose who we're friends with, shape those friendships ourselves. We're better at having those relationships. So all of this together, all of the maturity that we see happening, that we've talked about, as we enter emerging adulthood, actually end up benefiting how we feel about ourselves. I want to spend a few minutes talking specifically about different aspects of self-esteem that we see in America, because interestingly enough, we know that Americans place a much higher value on self-esteem than almost any other country. We value self-esteem more than other developed and developing cultures. So, because of that, we're more likely to view low self-esteem as being problematic, as being an issue, something we need to fix. That makes Americans have a very unique outlook on these self-judgments. On the other hand, we know that traditional countries, I'll use traditional Asian cultures as an example, do not value self-esteem as much. Think back to the interdependent self we talked about earlier. Traditional Asian cultures view high self-esteem as harmful to the group well-being, so they actually encourage self-criticism. Because of that, we end up seeing an interesting breakdown in the level of self-esteem in different ethnic populations within America. To start, we know that African American teenagers actually tend to have the highest self-esteem. They do not see a decline in self-esteem as they enter into adolescence and actually see a pretty steady increase throughout the teenage years, which is exciting. Unfortunately, we know that African American teens are one of the more at-risk groups for facing experiences of racism. And when that happens, we do see a decrease in self-esteem. That's a unique experience that African American teens have that white teens do not have. So even though we see overall higher, better self-esteem that increases, they do have kind of an additional hit that they often take in ways that majority group members do not. Next, we have white teenagers, white American teenagers. They tend to have higher self-esteem than Latinx, Asian, or Native American peers, but not quite as high as their African American peers. Asian American teenagers actually tend to have the lowest self-esteem. And we think that a big part of that is reflecting the cultural ideals that we just talked about, where it's not encouraged in their home or in their ethnic community. It might not necessarily be a bad thing for them if that is an important part of their culture. So when we talk about self-esteem levels, we want to keep in mind that a couple things. Our value placed on self-esteem changes depending on our culture. The averages, the norm, changes depending on our cultures. The last thing I want to look at is the fluctuation of self-esteem during adolescence, because as I'm sure many of you can remember, self-esteem is not constant during these teenage years. All individuals have something we call the baseline self-esteem, our overall judgments of self. You can think of as almost our default, our average, our baseline self-esteem. But it's possible for that baseline self-esteem to be surrounded by periods of higher and lower self-esteem. We call that the barometric self-esteem, the degree that our self-esteem fluctuates throughout the day. For children and for adults, the barometric self-esteem tends to be pretty low. We don't see that much fluctuation throughout a given day. But for adolescents, that degree of fluctuation tends to be especially volatile, where you will see more increases and decreases in any given day than you do during any other period of development. We see high highs and low lows throughout the day, where a teenager might wake up with their baseline self-esteem, and by the time they get down to breakfast, something's happened and they are feeling very negatively about themselves. But by the time they get to school, they've texted with a friend and they're feeling great about themselves. So we see a very high degree of volatility in the day-to-day experience of teenagers in terms of how they feel about themselves. An aspect of this that we know is important is who we're with at any given point in time. If you ask teenagers to report their self-esteem throughout the day, we do this with a research method where they're kind of prompted on their cell phones every hour to report their self-esteem and who they're with. If you do that, you can actually trace trends where maybe when the teenagers are at home, they're experiencing higher self-esteem, but when they're at school around their peers, their self-esteem tends to dip well below their baseline. It can, of course, happen the other way as well, depending on the individual. But we know that for teenagers, that social context tends to impact how they feel about themselves more than during other developmental periods. Another aspect of this that I want to mention is that self-esteem doesn't exist in a single domain. Even though self-esteem is our overall judgments about ourselves, those judgments do come from individual categories. So we actually see many different domains of self-esteem, or areas where we make judgments. Scholastic competence, or how good we are at school. Social competence, athletic competence, physical attractiveness, how good we are at work if we hold a job. That becomes more important as we enter into emerging adulthood. Romantic appeal, behavioral conduct, and even close friendships. We can have different levels of self-esteem in each of these categories. I can feel really great about my job competence, but really bad about my scholastic competence. So, the good news here is that sometimes having a higher degree of self-judgment or a more positive self-judgment in some of these categories can protect us. So imagine for a second that I feel very positively about my friendships, my behavior, my romantic appeal, my job competence, my physical competence, athletic and social competence, but I get a bad grade on a paper. If my self-esteem is high in these other domains, that can actually protect me from experiencing a decrease or taking a hit because I get a bad grade at school. So, research actually suggests that having these different domains of self-esteem can be very protective. We can actually help adolescents develop more overall positive self-esteem by encouraging them to develop these different domains. It can be very protective. So I want to end on that note by talking about some things that contribute to adolescents and emerging adult self-esteem and some outcomes. We know that the biggest influence on self-esteem is how accepted we feel by our peers and by our parents. Those are the two big ones. Teenagers who don't feel like they have any peers who accept them and feel unaccepted at home are going to have the lowest self-esteem. We know that approval from other adults, specifically teachers, can also be important though. So if you have a teenager who feels unaccepted at home and among their friends, having a teacher who they feel connected to, who they feel approves of them, can be very helpful. We also know that school success tends to play a big role for most teenagers as well. And we can help teenagers build more self-esteem in these different domains by teaching them two things: the benefits of learning new skills and developing knowledge. Encouraging teenagers to continue bettering themselves, to continue learning, to getting better at things, to practice at things, to learning more information can actually help them develop more positive self-esteem across the board. And when that happens, we know that teenagers tend to perform better in school and have better relationships. So, the causes of self-esteem produce effects that actually go back and cause self-esteem to continue rising. You can think of this as a vicious cycle, where the better we get at school, the better we feel about our relationships, the better our self-esteem, and the better we get at school and the better our relationships become. So this cause and effect really feeds into one another. And that's one reason why you see so much focus on self-esteem. That brings me to the end of Lecture 1. Lecture 2 will pick up by looking at the emotional self.